June 5, 1944, 11:47 p.m., somewhere over the English Channel. Flight Lieutenant Leonard Cheshire adjusted his Lancaster bomber's trim as his navigator called out the approach to the drop point. Behind him, in the bomb bay, sat no bombs. Instead, specially modified equipment waited to be released, equipment that most of his crew didn't fully understand and wasn't authorized to discuss. In the cockpit of another aircraft a few miles away, an American pilot guided his B-17 in a precise racetrack pattern over empty water, maintaining exact altitude and airspeed. His bombardier wasn't preparing to release explosives. He was dropping bundles of aluminum strips that would flutter down through the darkness, each strip carefully cut to a specific length. On the channel surface below, dozens of small boats traveled in carefully choreographed formations. They towed radar reflectors that created the signature of large ships. They broadcast recordings of ship engine noise underwater. They maintained radio discipline that suggested a massive invasion fleet moving toward the Pas-de-Calais. And in German radar stations along the French coast, operators watched their screens in growing alarm. The distinctive signatures were unmistakable. A massive fleet was approaching. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft. The invasion was coming, exactly where German intelligence had predicted it would come. Except none of it was real. The story of Operation Taxable, Operation Glimmer, and the broader deception campaign that preceded D-Day is a story of physics meeting psychology, of technology meeting cunning, and of how a few hundred men armed with aluminum foil and ingenuity convinced the German high command to defend the wrong beaches while the real invasion force struck 150 miles away. To understand the deception, you first need to understand radar itself, a technology that in 1944 was barely 5 years old in practical military application. The British had pioneered operational radar in the late 1930s, building the chain-home network of coastal radar stations that would prove crucial during the Battle of Britain. Radar worked on a simple principle that was extraordinarily difficult to implement in practice. A transmitter sent out radio waves that traveled at the speed of light. When those waves struck an object, some of the energy reflected back to a receiver. By measuring the time delay between transmission and reception, operators could calculate the distance to the object. By measuring the direction the antenna was pointing when it received the return, they could determine the bearing to the object. The physics was straightforward. The engineering was brutally hard. Radio waves at the frequencies useful for radar were difficult to generate with enough power to travel useful distances. Antennas capable of focusing those waves into narrow beams required precision manufacturing. Receivers sensitive enough to detect faint returns from distant targets had to filter out overwhelming amounts of background noise. Display systems had to present all this information in a form operators could interpret quickly. By 1944, both the Allies and Germans had solved these engineering challenges, though in different ways. British radar emphasized early warning and aircraft detection. German radar focused on precision fire control and aircraft interception. Each side had developed extensive networks of coastal and mobile radar stations. The German Freya early warning radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The more sophisticated Wurzburg fire control radar provided precise targeting information for anti-aircraft guns and fighters. Coastal radar stations along the Atlantic Wall created overlapping coverage that could track approaching ships and aircraft, well before they reached visual range. For Allied planners contemplating the invasion of France, German radar represented a fundamental problem. The invasion fleet would be detected hours before reaching the French coast. German defenders would have ample warning to position forces, prepare defenses, and coordinate counterattacks. The element of surprise, so crucial to successful amphibious assault, seemed impossible to achieve. This recognition led to one of the most intensive scientific efforts of the war. If radar couldn't be avoided, perhaps it could be deceived. If German operators were going to see returns on their screens regardless, perhaps those returns could be manipulated to show something other than reality. The science of radar deception began with understanding exactly what radar operators saw. A ship or aircraft appeared on radar screens as a bright return, a blip of light whose intensity corresponded to the size of the reflecting object. Large ships created strong returns. Small ships created weak returns. Aircraft created returns that varied with their altitude, angle, and construction materials. Radar couldn't determine what kind of object was creating a return. It only measured reflected radio energy. A small object that reflected radio waves efficiently could create the same return as a large object that reflected poorly. This fundamental limitation of radar physics created an opening for deception. British scientists, working at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, began experimenting with simple radar reflectors in 1942. They discovered that an arrangement of metal plates or wires, configured in specific geometric patterns, could reflect radio waves far more efficiently than solid objects of comparable size. A structure weighing a few pounds could create a radar return equivalent to a ship weighing thousands of tons. The principle was similar to how a corner reflector works in optics. Radio waves striking the reflector bounced between metal surfaces multiple times before returning toward the source, with each bounce adding to the total reflected energy. The result was a dramatically enhanced return that appeared on radar screens as a much larger object than actually existed. Even more promising was the discovery that strips of aluminum foil, cut to lengths corresponding to half the wavelength of enemy radar frequencies, created strong reflections. A bundle of these strips released from an aircraft would flutter down slowly, each strip acting as a miniature antenna that efficiently reflected radar energy. Thousands of strips falling through the air could create a radar signature resembling a formation of aircraft. The British called these aluminum strips window. The Americans called them chaff. Both recognized the technology's potential and its dangers. Window could blind radar, making it nearly impossible for operators to distinguish real targets from false ones. This would benefit attackers but would also blind defenders. British Bomber Command wanted to use window immediately to protect bombers from German radar-directed fighters and flak. Fighter Command opposed its use, fearing that German bombers could use the same technique against British radar defenses. The debate raged through 1942 and into 1943. The potential benefits were enormous. Bomber losses to radar-directed defenses were approaching unsustainable levels. Window could dramatically improve bomber survival rates. But the potential costs were equally significant. If Germany retaliated with window against British cities, the radar early warning system that had saved Britain in 1940 would be rendered ineffective. The impasse was finally broken by the recognition that Germany could develop window independently if they hadn't already. Better to use it first and gain the tactical advantage than to hold it back and risk having it used against you. In July 1943, RAF Bomber Command began using window on raids over Hamburg. The results were dramatic. German radar-controlled defenses were paralyzed. Bomber losses dropped by more than half on window-protected missions. The Germans quickly adapted. They modified their radar procedures, developed new filtering techniques, and trained operators to distinguish between window returns and real aircraft. But they never fully solved the problem. Window remained effective throughout the war, though with diminishing returns as German defenders improved their countermeasures. For Allied deception planners preparing for the invasion of France, window provided a crucial tool. If aluminum strips could make a few aircraft appear to be many, perhaps they could make a small diversionary force appear to be a major invasion fleet. The physics worked. The question was whether the psychology would work as well. The overall Allied deception plan for the invasion of France was codenamed Operation Bodyguard. It was one of the most ambitious deception campaigns in military history, involving fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, elaborate security measures, and carefully managed intelligence leaks. The radar deception operations were crucial components of this broader effort. The strategic situation in June 1944 favored deception. German intelligence, based on geography and military logic, had concluded that the Allied invasion would most likely come at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. The reasoning was sound. Pas-de-Calais offered the shortest sea crossing, the closest route to Germany, and proximity to the V weapon sites that were bombarding London. Allied planners intended to invade at Normandy, about 150 miles southwest of Pas-de-Calais. Normandy offered better beaches for the actual landing, but it was farther from England and required the invasion fleet to transit a longer stretch of water where it would be vulnerable to German counterattack. The success of the invasion depended partly on keeping German forces concentrated at Pas-de-Calais even after the Normandy landings began. The deception plan had to accomplish two goals simultaneously. First, it had to convince German commanders that Pas-de-Calais was the primary invasion target. Second, when the Normandy invasion began, it had to convince those same commanders that Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais was still coming. This required a level of sophistication far beyond simple misdirection. The Germans weren't stupid. They had experienced intelligence officers who understood deception techniques. Any obvious deception attempt would be recognized and discounted. The deception had to be subtle, consistent, and supported by multiple independent sources of intelligence that all told the same false story. Operation Fortitude was the component of bodyguard specifically focused on convincing Germans that Pas-de-Calais was the target. It included Operation Fortitude North, which suggested an invasion of Norway, and Operation Fortitude South, which indicated the Pas-de-Calais assault. The entire effort involved fake armies, dummy equipment, false radio traffic, and managed intelligence leaks through double agents. The radar deception operations were designated Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer. Taxable would simulate a convoy approaching Pas-de-Calais from the Dover area. Glimmer would simulate a convoy approaching from the south, suggesting a two-pronged assault on Pas-de-Calais. Both operations would use window, naval decoys, and electronic deception to create radar signatures of massive fleets that didn't exist. Planning began in early 1944. The concept was straightforward, but the execution details were complex. Aircraft would fly precise patterns while dropping window at calculated intervals. The window would create radar returns that, to German radar operators, would appear to be formations of ships and aircraft moving slowly toward France. The physics required careful calculation. Window dropped from aircraft falls at a predictable rate depending on altitude, air density, and the size of the aluminum strips. By maintaining precise altitude and airspeed while dropping window at specific intervals, aircraft could create a cloud of radar reflections that appeared to move slowly across the water toward France at speeds consistent with naval vessels. The key was making the simulation believable. Real invasion fleets don't move in straight lines at constant speeds. They maneuver to avoid obstacles, adjust formations, and coordinate movements. The aircraft dropping window had to replicate these patterns, creating radar pictures that evolved naturally rather than following rigid geometric paths that might alert suspicious German operators. Test flights were conducted over the Channel in March and April 1944. Practicing the patterns and refining the procedures. Observers with radar equipment watched to see what the simulated fleets looked like from the perspective of radar operators. The tests revealed problems. Initial attempts created returns that were too uniform, too perfect. Real ship formations had variations in speed and spacing that the simulations lacked. The solution was to introduce controlled randomness. Aircraft would deviate slightly from their planned tracks, creating natural-looking variations in the radar picture. Window dispensing rates would be varied to create stronger and weaker returns, simulating different ship sizes within the formation. The result was a simulation that looked organic rather than artificial. Naval components were equally important. Small boats would accompany the aircraft, positioned at the apparent front of the simulated convoy. These boats towed balloon-mounted radar reflectors that created strong, steady returns at surface level. To German radar operators, these would appear to be the lead elements of the invasion fleet, with the mass of the fleet following behind. The boats also carried equipment to simulate the underwater noise signatures of large ships. Recordings of ship engine sounds were played through underwater speakers at carefully calculated volumes. German underwater listening posts, which complemented the radar network, would detect these sounds and report major naval formations transiting the channel. Radio deception added another layer of credibility. The boats maintained radio discipline consistent with a real invasion fleet under orders for radio silence. Occasional necessary transmissions used codes and procedures that German intelligence would recognize as consistent with major naval operations. Every detail had to reinforce the illusion. The window itself was remarkably simple technology that required precise manufacturing. Each strip was cut from aluminum foil to an exact length corresponding to half the wavelength of German radar frequencies. For the Freya early warning radar operating around 125 MHz, the optimal window length was approximately 4 feet. For higher frequency radars like the Wurzburg, shorter strips around 1 foot worked better. The Allies manufactured window in massive quantities. Factories in Britain cut aluminum foil into strips, bundled them together, and packaged them for aerial dispensing. Each bundle weighed only a few ounces but contained hundreds of individual strips. When released from an aircraft, the bundle would break apart and the strips would separate, each falling independently and reflecting radar energy. The dispensing mechanisms were critical. Early experiments used simple chutes that allowed bundles to be pushed out manually by crew members. This was labor-intensive and difficult to control precisely. Improved systems used mechanized dispensers that could release bundles at controlled intervals, freeing crew members for other tasks and ensuring consistent dispensing rates. The aircraft used for Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer were primarily short Stirling bombers and Henley Page Halifax bombers. These 4-engine heavy bombers had the range to maintain the deception patterns for hours and the payload capacity to carry enormous quantities of window. They were also reliable enough for the precise flying required to maintain the simulation. Navigation was perhaps the most challenging aspect. The aircraft had to fly exact patterns for hours, maintaining precise altitude and airspeed, all while operating over water at night with minimal visual references. The patterns themselves were complex, requiring aircraft to fly orbiting courses that advanced slowly toward France while continuously dropping window. The orbiting pattern was crucial to the deception. An aircraft flying straight toward France while dropping window would create a return that moved too fast, immediately alerting radar operators that they were seeing an aircraft rather than ships. But an aircraft flying in an oval pattern, advancing slightly with each orbit, created window clouds that appeared to move at ship speeds of 7 to 8 knots. Each orbit took approximately 7 minutes to complete. During that time, the aircraft would advance about 2 miles closer to France. The window dropped during the orbit would fall slowly, remaining aloft for 15 to 20 minutes depending on altitude. The result was a continuous cloud of radar reflections that appeared to German operators as a ship formation, moving steadily across the channel. Multiple aircraft flew parallel tracks spaced several miles apart. This created the impression of a broad convoy front rather than a narrow column. The spacing was calculated to ensure that window clouds from adjacent aircraft overlapped slightly, filling in gaps that might alert operators to the deception. The naval decoys towed by boats were engineering achievements in themselves. The reflectors consisted of multiple metal plates arranged in corner reflector configurations, suspended from balloons that lifted them 20 to 30 feet above the water surface. This elevation was crucial because it placed the reflectors at the height where radar operators expected to see returns from ship superstructures. Each reflector assembly weighed about 40 pounds and created a radar return equivalent to a ship of several thousand tons. The balloons were tethered to boats by cables that allowed the reflectors to be raised or lowered to maintain optimal height despite changing wind conditions. The boats themselves were small fishing vessels and motor launches, chosen for reliability and seakeeping rather than speed. The underwater acoustic deception used sophisticated recordings. Engineers had recorded the sounds of major warships under various conditions, capturing the distinctive acoustic signatures of different vessel types. These recordings were played through underwater speakers, powerful enough to be heard at the ranges German hydrophone arrays operated. The playback had to be managed carefully. Simply broadcasting ship noises continuously would sound artificial. Instead, operators varied the playback to simulate a fleet maneuvering, with individual ships temporarily increasing or decreasing engine noise as they adjusted position within the formation. This attention to realistic detail made the acoustic deception as convincing as the radar deception. Communication security was maintained through strict radio discipline. The boats participating in the deception operations communicated using low-power radios operating on frequencies that German intercept services weren't monitoring closely. The aircraft maintained near-total radio silence, breaking it only for essential navigation or safety transmissions. The Germans heard what they expected to hear, an invasion fleet maintaining communication security. The weeks leading up to D-Day were consumed by intensive rehearsal. The deception operations required coordination between dozens of aircraft, multiple naval vessels, and support units managing communications and navigation aids. Every element had to work perfectly because there would be no opportunity for second attempts. Flight crews practiced the orbiting patterns until they could maintain them in their sleep. Navigation became so precise that pilots could judge their position by timing and feel, cross-checking with the limited navigation aids available. The patterns became instinctive, muscle memory that would allow crews to maintain them, even under the stress and fatigue of the actual operation. Window dispensing crews drilled on maintaining consistent release rates. The bundles had to be pushed out at exact intervals, neither too fast nor too slow. Too much window would create an unrealistically strong radar return. Too little would create a weak return that might not be detected at effective ranges. The sweet spot was narrow, requiring crew members to develop a steady rhythm. The naval teams rehearsed their coordination with the aircraft. The boats had to maintain precise positions relative to the window-dropping aircraft, creating the impression of a unified convoy rather than separate elements. This required navigation skills that rivaled the aircrews, keeping station in darkness over featureless water while maintaining exact speeds and headings. Communications procedures were refined through repeated practice. Everyone involved in the operation had to know their roles so thoroughly that they could execute under adverse conditions. Radio protocols were simplified to minimize transmission time while ensuring essential information could be passed quickly if circumstances changed. Weather contingencies were planned in exhaustive detail. The deception operations had to proceed regardless of conditions because they were integral to the invasion plan. If weather forced modifications to the deception pattern, everyone had to understand how to adapt while maintaining the overall simulation. Backup procedures were developed for every conceivable problem. The rehearsals revealed unexpected challenges. Wind conditions affected window dispersion patterns. Strong winds caused the aluminum strips to drift, distorting the simulated convoy formation. Light winds caused the strips to fall more vertically, creating stronger but more compact radar returns. Crews learned to adjust dispensing rates based on observed wind conditions. Cloud cover affected navigation. Crews needed to see occasional stars or moon illumination to verify their positions between navigation fixes. On completely overcast nights, navigation became much more difficult, increasing the risk of drift from planned tracks. Procedures were developed for using radio navigation aids more extensively when visual references weren't available. Equipment failures were addressed through redundancy. Aircraft carried spare window dispensers in case primary systems malfunctioned. Boats carried backup radar reflectors that could be deployed if primary assemblies failed. Every critical system had a backup, and every backup had procedures for rapid deployment. The human factors received careful attention. The operations would require crews to maintain concentration and performance for hours in darkness over water. Fatigue management became important. Crews were rotated through schedules that allowed adequate rest before missions. Meals and coffee were provided to help maintain alertness during the long operations. Stress inoculation was part of the training. Crews conducted rehearsals under simulated emergency conditions, practicing how to respond if aircraft were attacked, if equipment failed, or if weather forced them off their planned tracks. The goal was to ensure that whatever happened on the night of the invasion, crews would have practiced responses and could adapt without panic. By late May 1944, the deception forces were as ready as training could make them. The operations had been rehearsed to the point where every participant could execute their role in darkness. In bad weather, under stress, and with minimal communication. The technical systems had been refined until they reliably created radar signatures that matched the planned simulation. All that remained was the execution. June 5, 1944. The invasion had been postponed 24 hours due to weather, but Eisenhower had made the decision to proceed on June 6, despite marginal conditions. The deception operations would begin late on June 5, hours before the first landing craft touched down on Normandy beaches. Operation Taxable launched first. Sterling bombers lifted off from bases in southern England, forming up over the Channel and heading toward their designated patrol areas east of Dover. Aircraft carried thousands of window bundles and fuel for approximately 6 hours of flight operations. The crews settled into the routine they had practiced dozens of times. Flight Lieutenant Cheshire's Lancaster was one of 18 aircraft assigned to Taxable. His navigator had plotted the exact track they would fly, a series of overlapping ovals that would advance them slowly toward the French coast near Boulogne, directly toward Pas-de-Calais. The pattern was calculated to create a radar picture of a convoy moving at 7 knots. At precisely 11 p.m., the window drop began. Bundles tumbled from dispensers, breaking apart in the slipstream and creating clouds of aluminum strips that fell slowly through the darkness. Each aircraft maintained exact altitude and airspeed, advancing along their tracks with navigation precision measured in yards rather than miles. Below the aircraft, small boats towing radar reflectors positioned themselves at the front of the simulated convoy. The boats maintained speeds that matched the apparent advance rate of the window clouds above them. To German radar operators watching from the French coast, the picture was developing exactly as planned, a large surface formation approaching from England, covered by aircraft overhead. Operation Glimmer ran simultaneously, using similar techniques to simulate a second convoy approaching from slightly farther west. The two simulated convoys created the impression of a major two-pronged assault on Pas-de-Calais, exactly what German intelligence had predicted. In German radar stations along the coast, operators watched the returns with growing concern. The Freya stations detected the formations at ranges exceeding 80 miles. As the apparent convoys closed the range, more details became visible. The formations appeared to consist of dozens of major vessels with air cover overhead. This was exactly the pattern German operators had been trained to recognize as an invasion fleet. Reports flowed up the German chain of command. Multiple radar stations were detecting major formations approaching Pas-de-Calais. Coastal defense batteries went to full alert. Infantry units moved to defensive positions. Artillery was repositioned to cover the beaches where the invasion appeared to be coming. The deception was working perfectly. German commanders, already predisposed to believe Pas-de-Calais was the target, saw radar evidence confirming their expectations. The formations looked right, moved right, and appeared in exactly the locations that made strategic sense for an invasion of that area. The operations continued for hours. Aircraft flew orbit after orbit, maintaining the simulation with mechanical precision. Window dispensers operated continuously, consuming thousands of pounds of aluminum strips. Crews fought fatigue, maintaining concentration despite the monotony of precise flying in darkness. Around 2 a.m., the first reports reached German headquarters that paratroopers were landing in Normandy. This created confusion. Was Normandy the main assault? Or was it a diversion to draw forces away from Pas-de-Calais, where the radar clearly showed major formations approaching? The radar evidence was persuasive. You couldn't fake radar returns, or so German intelligence had always maintained. What radar detected was real. The massive formations approaching Pas-de-Calais were real invasion fleets. The Normandy landings, despite the drama of airborne assault, must be the diversion. This interpretation was exactly what Allied planners needed. German reserves that might have reinforced Normandy remained concentrated at Pas-de-Calais, waiting to repel the invasion that radar showed was coming. The 15th Army, positioned to defend Pas-de-Calais, stayed in place rather than moving to support the 7th Army fighting in Normandy. As dawn approached, the deception operations faced their most critical phase. The simulated convoys had to be withdrawn before German fighters could be sent to investigate visually. If fighters discovered that no ships existed where radar showed dozens of vessels, the deception would be revealed and its value lost. The withdrawal was carefully choreographed. Aircraft gradually reduced their window dispensing rates while beginning to turn back toward England. The radar picture showed the formations slowing and apparently reversing course, as if commanders had decided to delay the assault. To German observers, this made sense. Perhaps the forces had been detected and were returning to England to wait for better conditions. The boats towing radar reflectors turned back simultaneously, maintaining the appearance of coordinated fleet movement. The underwater acoustic transmissions gradually faded, simulating ships increasing their distance from the coast. Every aspect of the simulation remained consistent with the behaviors German operators expected from a real fleet. By sunrise, the deception forces were returning to their bases in England. They had maintained the simulation for over 6 hours, creating radar pictures that convinced German commanders that a major invasion force had approached Pas-de-Calais before turning back. The actual invasion fleet landing in Normandy was dismissed as a diversion, exactly as the deception planners had intended. In German command posts across France, the morning of June 6th brought confusion and conflicting reports. The invasion was clearly happening in Normandy. Naval forces were landing on multiple beaches. Airborne forces had seized key positions inland. The scale was massive, far larger than could be explained as a diversion. Yet the radar evidence from the previous night couldn't be dismissed. Multiple independent radar stations had tracked major formations approaching Pas-de-Calais. Those formations had been real enough to appear on radar screens for hours. They had moved with the characteristic patterns of naval vessels. They had been accompanied by aircraft. German intelligence officers tried to reconcile the contradiction. Some argued that the Normandy landings were indeed the main effort, and the Pas-de-Calais formations had been a deception. Others maintained that the radar evidence was too strong to dismiss, and that Pas-de-Calais remained the primary threat with Normandy being the diversion. This uncertainty paralyzed German strategic decision-making during the critical hours after the invasion began. The 15th Army, which might have been committed to counterattack in Normandy, remained at Pas-de-Calais. Panzer divisions held in reserve weren't released because High Command couldn't determine where they were most needed. The confusion that the deception operations created bought the Allies crucial time. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, later stated in interrogations that the deception operations had significantly affected German response to the invasion. The uncertainty about whether Pas-de-Calais remained threatened prevented full commitment of reserves to Normandy until it was too late to prevent the Allied lodgment from being established. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, was particularly affected by the conflicting intelligence. Von Rundstedt had access to all the intelligence sources: radar reports, aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and agent reports. Everything except the radar pointed to Normandy as the main invasion. But the radar evidence for Pas-de-Calais was so convincing that he couldn't dismiss it. The radar operators themselves never realized they had been deceived. The returns they saw were real. The formations appeared on multiple independent radar sets, eliminating the possibility of equipment malfunction or operator error. The movements and behaviors matched what they expected from invasion fleets. Only after the war, when captured German officers were shown the details of Operations Taxable and Glimmer, did they understand what had been done to them. The psychological impact was significant. German forces had prided themselves on their technological sophistication and intelligence capabilities. The realization that they had been so completely fooled by relatively simple deception techniques was demoralizing. If radar couldn't be trusted, what could be trusted? If the Allies could create phantom invasion fleets at will, how could Germany defend against the real thing? Some German technical officers immediately recognized the implications. If the Allies could fool radar on June 5th to 6th, they could do it again. Every future radar detection would be suspect. The technological advantage that radar had provided was compromised, perhaps permanently. German forces would have to develop new procedures, new filters, new ways to distinguish real targets from decoys. The attempted countermeasures developed by German forces over the following months showed the effectiveness of the Allied deception. New radar operating procedures emphasized confirmation through multiple independent sensors. Visual observation became required before committing forces based on radar detection alone. These procedures slowed German response times and reduced the effectiveness of their radar network. Operations Taxable and Glimmer were components of a larger deception effort that began months before the invasion. The complete campaign involved creating an entire fictitious army group, complete with radio traffic, equipment, and apparent preparations for an invasion of Pas-de-Calais. The first United States Army Group, or FUSAG, existed only on paper and in German intelligence assessments. It was supposedly commanded by General George Patton, whose reputation made him a credible choice to lead the main invasion force. Allied deception planners understood that German intelligence would assume the Allies would put their best commander in charge of the most important operation. FUSAG's bases in southeastern England were equipped with dummy tanks, trucks, and landing craft visible to German aerial reconnaissance. Radio operators generated traffic patterns consistent with a major headquarters coordinating invasion preparations. The traffic volume and characteristics matched what German signals intelligence would expect from a force preparing for cross-channel assault. Double agents controlled by British intelligence fed information to German handlers that reinforced the FUSAG deception. These agents reported on troop movements, equipment concentrations, and preparations that all pointed to Pas-de-Calais as the target. The information was carefully calibrated to be believable without being so specific that it seemed suspicious. The deception extended to diplomatic channels. Neutral diplomats were allowed to observe activities in southeastern England that suggested major military preparations. Their reports to their governments, which German intelligence monitored, provided independent confirmation of the FUSAG buildup. The use of neutral observers added credibility because Germany knew these sources weren't under Allied control. Strategic bombing patterns were adjusted to support the deception. Allied air forces bombed transportation and communication targets across northern France, but the bombing was weighted toward Pas-de-Calais. For every ton of bombs dropped on targets around Normandy, 2 tons were dropped around Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence analyzing the bombing patterns concluded that the Allies were preparing battlefield conditions around Pas-de-Calais. The deception continued even after the invasion began. For weeks following June 6, Allied intelligence fed information to German commanders suggesting that the Normandy landings were succeeding better than expected, and that the planned Pas-de-Calais invasion had been cancelled in favor of exploiting the Normandy success. This prevented German forces from realizing immediately that Normandy was and always had been the main effort. The cumulative effect of all these deception elements was to create in German minds a false picture that seemed to be confirmed by multiple independent sources. No single element would have been convincing by itself. But when radar detection, signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, agent reports, and bombing patterns all told the same story, German commanders believed because not believing required dismissing too much apparently credible evidence. The success of the deception campaign validated years of Allied investment in deception capabilities. Organizations like the London Controlling Section, which coordinated strategic deception, and the double-cross system, which managed German agents, proved their value through concrete operational results. The lives saved and the strategic advantage gained justified the resources devoted to deception. The radar deception techniques pioneered for D-Day continued to evolve throughout the remainder of the war. Window usage became routine on bomber raids, with dispensing rates and patterns optimized for different tactical situations. The Germans developed partial countermeasures, and the Allies developed countermeasures in an ongoing technological competition. More sophisticated electronic deception equipment was developed. Active jamming systems that broadcast powerful radio signals to overwhelm radar receivers supplemented the passive deception of window. Specialized aircraft carrying jamming equipment could create corridors through radar coverage that bomber streams could follow with reduced detection probability. Radar reflectors became more refined. Lighter materials and improved designs created decoys that were easier to deploy but just as effective as earlier versions. Some could be dropped from aircraft, floating down by parachute while creating radar returns resembling aircraft or vehicles. Others were designed for surface deployment, simulating tanks or artillery positions. The cat-and-mouse game between radar and radar countermeasures accelerated. German radar operators learned to recognize certain characteristics of window clouds that distinguish them from real targets. Allied scientists modified window designs to make detection harder. German engineers developed radars using different frequencies or polarizations that were less susceptible to window interference. Allied countermeasures evolved to address the new radar types. This technological competition didn't end with World War II. The principles established during the war formed the foundation of modern electronic warfare. Today's stealth aircraft, radar jamming systems, and decoy technologies are direct descendants of the window strips and radar reflectors used on D-Day. The organizational structures created to coordinate deception operations also had lasting impact. The close integration of scientists, intelligence officers, and operational commanders that characterized Allied deception planning became a model for future military technical cooperation. The recognition that deception required specialized skills and dedicated organizations led to permanent electronic warfare units in post-war military forces. Training programs were established to teach radar operators how to recognize and counter deception techniques. These programs incorporated lessons from D-Day and subsequent operations, creating institutional knowledge that could be passed to new generations of operators. The cat-and-mouse game became formalized into doctrine and training curricula. The intelligence implications were equally significant. The success of the D-Day deceptions demonstrated that even technologically sophisticated sensors could be fooled by adversaries who understood their principles and limitations. Intelligence analysis procedures were modified to include greater skepticism about single-source reporting and increased emphasis on multi-source confirmation. Behind the technical achievement were the men who executed the operations. The aircrews who flew precision patterns for hours in darkness over water were performing one of the war's most unusual missions. They weren't attacking targets or defending against enemies. They were flying careful patterns and dropping aluminum foil, trusting that their actions were contributing to something important, even though most didn't fully understand what. Flight Lieutenant Cheshire, who survived the war and later wrote about his experiences, described the operation as surreal. Flying in darkness over the channel, dropping bundles of metal strips while maintaining exact altitude and airspeed, seemed disconnected from the massive invasion happening simultaneously elsewhere. The crews couldn't see the results of their work. They had no way to know whether the deception was succeeding. They simply followed their procedures and trusted that someone higher up knew what they were doing. The boat crews had similar experiences of isolation and uncertainty. Towing radar reflectors across the channel in darkness, they were too close to the water to see anything except their immediate surroundings. They navigated by compass and calculation, trusting that they were in the right place at the right time. German coastal batteries occasionally fired at them, shells falling close enough to create waterspouts but not scoring direct hits. The window dispensing crews dealt with physical exhaustion. Pushing out bundles of aluminum strips every few seconds for hours was repetitive, mindless work that was also surprisingly tiring. Hands became sore, arms grew heavy. The temptation to slow the dispensing rate or take breaks had to be consciously resisted because maintaining exact timing was critical to the simulation. Some crews dealt with equipment failures that threatened to compromise their missions. Jam dispensers had to be cleared while maintaining flight patterns. Backup systems had to be activated without breaking the rhythm of the operation. These were the small crises that could have derailed the deception if crews hadn't been so thoroughly trained that they could troubleshoot problems almost automatically. One navigator later recalled the tension of the operation. His job was to keep the aircraft on exact track despite winds, despite darkness, despite the complete absence of visual references. He used celestial navigation when stars were visible, dead reckoning when they weren't, and occasional radio fixes when absolutely necessary. The margin for error was measured in hundreds of yards over tracks that extended for miles. A navigation error that put his aircraft even slightly off course would create gaps in the window coverage that might alert German radar operators. The secrecy surrounding the operations added psychological stress. Crews were briefed on their missions but given minimal information about the larger context. They knew the invasion was imminent, but didn't know exactly when or where. They understood their missions were important, but couldn't discuss them even with other aircrew members not directly involved. This compartmentalization was necessary for security, but created isolation that added to the stress of operations. Some crew members experienced the cognitive dissonance of performing dangerous missions that involved no direct combat. They were being shot at occasionally by coastal batteries. They were at risk of mechanical failures over water. They could be intercepted by German fighters. But they weren't shooting back. They weren't attacking targets. They were simply flying patterns and dropping aluminum strips. The lack of direct action made the danger seem somehow more arbitrary, more difficult to process psychologically. Yet the missions continued successfully. Crews executed their procedures despite exhaustion, despite danger, despite uncertainty about results. The discipline and training that prepared them for these unusual missions proved adequate to the challenge. Looking back after the war, many of these airmen expressed pride in having participated in operations that were so crucial to the invasion's success, even though their contributions were less visible than those of bomber crews, attacking targets, or fighter pilots shooting down enemy aircraft. The boat crews developed their own forms of camaraderie and dark humor. Towing radar reflectors while German guns occasionally shot at them created bonds among men who shared the peculiar experience. They joked about being bait, about sailing around the channel with targets painted on their boats, about the apparent absurdity of their missions. The humor was a coping mechanism that helped manage stress. One boat commander later described watching shells fall around his vessel while he concentrated on maintaining exact speed and heading. The juxtaposition of mortal danger and navigational precision created a strange mental state where both concerns occupied his mind simultaneously. He had to ignore the shells enough to focus on navigation while remaining alert enough to take evasive action if a shell got too close. The mental balancing act was exhausting in ways that purely physical danger wasn't. The support personnel who prepared the window and maintained the equipment had their own contributions to the success. Thousands of pounds of aluminum strips had to be cut to exact specifications, bundled properly, and loaded onto aircraft. The work was repetitive and offered no glory, but it was essential. A batch of window cut to the wrong length would create radar returns at the wrong frequency, potentially revealing the deception. Ground crews who maintained the aircraft faced their own pressures. The bombers used for deception operations had to be mechanically perfect. Navigation equipment had to function flawlessly. Any mechanical failure that forced an aircraft to abort during the operation would create a gap in the window coverage that might alert German operators. The maintainers worked with unusual intensity to ensure every aircraft was fully mission-capable. The morning of June 6th brought confirmation that the invasion had succeeded in establishing lodgements on all 5 Normandy beaches. German resistance had been fierce in places, particularly at Omaha Beach, but the invasion force was ashore and expanding its perimeter. The deception operations had accomplished their primary objective. German forces that might have reinforced Normandy remained concentrated at Pas-de-Calais. Allied intelligence officers began the process of assessing how effectively the deception had worked. Intercepted German communications provided some insight. References to major formations detected approaching Pas-de-Calais appeared in multiple German reports from June 5th and 6th. Orders directing forces to defend Pas-de-Calais rather than moving to Normandy suggested that German high command believed the Normandy landings were diversionary. More detailed assessment would come later through interrogation of captured German officers and examination of captured documents. These sources confirmed that the radar deception had been highly effective. German commanders had received radar intelligence suggesting major forces approaching Pas-de-Calais and had made strategic decisions based on that intelligence. The 15th Army's failure to move to Normandy during the critical first days of the invasion was directly attributable to the belief that Pas-de-Calais remained threatened. This army included 19 divisions, most at or near full strength. If even a portion of these forces had been committed to Normandy on June 6th or 7th, they might have contained or even crushed the Allied beachhead before it could be reinforced and expanded. The strategic value of keeping the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais for several days was enormous. It allowed Allied forces to build up strength in Normandy without facing the full weight of German defensive capabilities. By the time German High Command recognized that Normandy was the only invasion and began shifting forces from Pas-de-Calais, the Allied lodgment was secure enough that reinforcements couldn't dislodge it. Operational researchers later estimated that the deception operations probably saved thousands of Allied lives. If German forces had responded more quickly and decisively to the Normandy landings, casualties during the initial assault and the subsequent battles to expand the beachhead would have been significantly higher. The specific number would never be known, but the general conclusion was clear. The deception had been worth far more than it cost. The cost itself had been remarkably low. A few dozen aircraft, a handful of boats, several tons of aluminum strips, and the efforts of a few hundred men had created a strategic effect disproportionate to the resources invested. This return on investment validated the concept of deception as a force multiplier and encouraged further development of deception capabilities. The lessons learned from Operations Taxable and Glimmer were documented and incorporated into doctrine. Future deception operations would benefit from the experience gained on D-Day. The specific techniques might need modification to counter improved German defenses, but the fundamental principles remained sound. The technical lessons were equally valuable. The precise flying required for the deception operations pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 1944 navigation technology. The experience gained in conducting these missions improved overall navigation capabilities and contributed to the development of better navigation aids for post-war aviation. The inter-service cooperation required for the operations also provided lessons. Coordinating aircraft and naval vessels in a complex, time-sensitive operation required communication and planning procedures that hadn't existed before. The processes developed for Operations Taxable and Glimmer became models for future joint operations. The success of the D-Day deceptions was part of a larger intelligence war that raged throughout World War II. The Allies' success in breaking German codes, managing double agents, and conducting deception operations gave them persistent intelligence advantages that affected operations at every level. The ultra-secret, the Allied code-breaking program that read German Enigma machine communications, provided insight into whether deception operations were succeeding. Decrypted German messages sometimes revealed what German commanders believed about Allied intentions. This feedback allowed deception planners to adjust their operations in near real time. For the D-Day deceptions, Ultra confirmed that German intelligence had accepted the FUSAC fiction. Decrypted messages referred to the fictitious army group as if it were real. German units received orders based on the assumption that FUSAG would eventually invade Pas-de-Calais. This confirmation that the strategic deception was working gave allied planners' confidence that the tactical radar deceptions would be similarly effective. The double-cross system, which controlled German agents operating in Britain, was crucial to the deception campaign. Every German agent in Britain had been captured and either executed or turned to work for British intelligence. This meant that all intelligence Germany received from agent sources was actually controlled by the Allies and could be used to reinforce deception themes. The agents reported on FUSAG preparations, confirming what German intelligence learned from other sources. They provided details about troop movements, equipment types, and apparent invasion preparations that all supported the Pas-de-Calais deception. The reports were carefully crafted to be believable without being so detailed that they seemed suspicious. German intelligence never realized that all their agents in Britain were compromised. They continued to trust agent reporting even when it consistently pointed toward Pas-de-Calais. The failure to recognize the double-cross compromise was one of German intelligence's most significant failures of the war. The combination of signals intelligence, controlled agents, and physical deception created a multi-layered deception that was extremely difficult for German intelligence to penetrate. Each element reinforced the others. Radar detected formations that agents had reported were being prepared. Radio traffic suggested headquarters coordinating operations that aerial reconnaissance showed were being staged. The consistency across multiple independent sources made the deception highly credible. German intelligence failures contributed to the deception's success. The intelligence services were fragmented, with military intelligence, SS intelligence, and Foreign Office intelligence operating independently and often competing with each other. This lack of coordination meant that contradictory information wasn't always recognized or resolved. Each service tended to believe its own sources and discount information from other services. The German tendency toward confirmation bias also helped the deception. German intelligence had concluded for logical reasons that Pas-de-Calais was the most likely invasion target. Once this assessment was made, intelligence officers unconsciously weighted information that confirmed it more heavily than information that contradicted it. The deception operations fed this bias, providing the confirmation German officers were predisposed to accept. The D-Day deception operations influenced military thinking about electronic warfare and deception for decades after the war. The demonstrated effectiveness of radar deception led to substantial investment in electronic warfare capabilities by all major military powers during the Cold War. The Soviet Union, learning from German experiences and captured German documents, developed extensive electronic warfare capabilities. Soviet doctrine emphasized deception and maskirovka, military deception, as fundamental operational concepts. The radar deception techniques pioneered by the Allies were refined and incorporated into Soviet military planning. The United States and NATO allies continued developing electronic warfare technology throughout the Cold War. Radar jamming, deception, and countermeasures became standard components of air operations. Specialized electronic warfare aircraft, like the EA-6B Prowler and EF-111 Raven, were developed specifically to suppress enemy air defenses through jamming and deception. Modern stealth technology represents an evolution of the same basic principle demonstrated by Window in 1944, controlling what radar sees. Instead of creating false returns, stealth aircraft minimize returns, making themselves difficult to detect. But the underlying concept is identical. Radar is a sensor that can be deceived through understanding and exploiting its physical principles. The organizational legacy was equally significant. Electronic warfare became a recognized military specialty with dedicated career paths, training programs, and units. The ad hoc arrangements that characterized World War II electronic warfare evolved into permanent institutions with doctrine, tactics, and equipment specifically designed for the electronic warfare mission. The intelligence community also absorbed lessons from the D-Day deceptions. The value of multi-source intelligence fusion was recognized. The importance of skepticism and critical analysis when interpreting intelligence was reinforced. Procedures for identifying deception attempts became standard parts of intelligence training. The double-cross system's success led to permanent counterintelligence capabilities focused on identifying and controlling enemy agents. The British MI5 and American FBI developed sophisticated programs for managing foreign intelligence operations on their territory. The techniques developed during World War II were refined and applied throughout the Cold War and beyond. Academic study of military deception expanded after the war. The D-Day operations became case studies taught at military schools worldwide. The psychological principles, the technical methods, and the organizational approaches were analyzed and incorporated into military education curricula. The ethical dimensions of deception in warfare were debated. Some argued that deception was inherently dishonorable, incompatible with military professionalism. Others argued that deception that saved lives by allowing operations to succeed with fewer casualties was not just acceptable but morally imperative. The D-Day deceptions, with their clearly positive outcomes, generally supported the pro-deception position. Only after the war could the full technical details of the deception operations be discussed publicly. The secrecy during the war had been so tight that even many of the participants didn't fully understand how their individual contributions fit into the larger operation. The window bundles used in Operations Taxable and Glimmer consisted of approximately 2,000 individual aluminum strips per bundle. Each strip was 400 millimeters long and 25 millimeters wide, cut from aluminum foil approximately 0.02 millimeters thick. The strips were tied together in bundles with string that would break when the bundle was thrown from the aircraft, allowing the strips to separate and fall independently. The aircraft maintained altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet during window drops. At these altitudes, the strips would remain aloft for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, depending on atmospheric conditions. This fall time was critical to creating the illusion of slow-moving ships rather than fast-moving aircraft. The dispensing rate was approximately one bundle every 30 seconds. This rate created a continuous cloud of window that appeared on German radar screens as a solid formation rather than discrete clusters. Each aircraft carried enough window for approximately 6 hours of continuous dispensing. The flight patterns were calculated to advance toward France at approximately 7 knots, the speed of a typical convoy. Each orbit of the pattern took 7 minutes and advanced the aircraft approximately 2 miles closer to the French coast. This required remarkably precise navigation, given the limited navigation aids available in 1944. The radar reflectors towed by boats were corner reflector designs consisting of metal plates arranged in triangular configurations. Each reflector had an effective radar cross-section of approximately 10,000 square meters, equivalent to a medium-sized cargo ship. The reflectors were suspended from barrage balloons at heights of 20 to 30 feet above the water surface. The boats maintaining the surface element of the deception traveled in formations spaced to match typical convoy patterns. They maintained radio silence except for minimal essential communications. The underwater acoustic transmissions used recordings played at calculated volumes to simulate ship propulsion noises at the ranges German hydrophone arrays would detect them. The coordination between air and surface elements required precise timing. The boats had to be positioned at the apparent front of the simulated convoy, with the window-dropping aircraft creating the appearance of a larger formation following behind. This required the boats to coordinate their movements with aircraft they couldn't see and couldn't communicate with except through prearranged timing. The operations were planned to terminate before dawn when visual observation might reveal the deception. The withdrawal was gradual, with window dispensing rates decreasing and aircraft beginning to turn back toward England. This created the radar picture of a formation reversing course rather than simply disappearing, which would have been suspicious. The secret Allied operations that fooled German radar before D-Day represent one of the most successful military deception campaigns in history. Through a combination of technical innovation, careful planning, thorough training, and flawless execution, a few hundred men with aluminum foil and radar reflectors convinced the German High Command that a massive invasion fleet was approaching Pas-de-Calais while the real invasion landed in Normandy. The operations succeeded because they exploited German expectations and cognitive biases. German intelligence had logically concluded that Pas-de-Calais was the likely invasion target. The deception operations provided radar evidence that confirmed this expectation. German commanders saw what they expected to see, and that expectation prevented them from recognizing the truth until it was too late. The technical sophistication of the deception was matched by its psychological sophistication. The planners understood that German officers wouldn't believe a deception that was too obvious or too simple. They created a multi-layered deception that appeared to be confirmed by multiple independent sources: radar detection, signals intelligence, agent reports, and aerial reconnaissance. The consistency across these sources made the false picture credible. The operational impact was substantial and measurable. German forces that might have reinforced Normandy remained at Pas-de-Calais. This allowed the Allied invasion force to establish and expand its beachhead with less opposition than would otherwise have been encountered. The lives saved and the strategic advantage gained justified the resources invested in the deception. The long-term impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. The techniques developed for the D-Day deceptions became the foundation of modern electronic warfare. The organizational structures created to coordinate deception operations evolved into permanent military institutions. The lessons learned influenced military thinking about intelligence, deception, and the relationship between technology and warfare. The story of Operations Taxable and Glimmer is ultimately a story about the power of information in warfare. Physical forces matter, but what commanders believe about those forces matters just as much. By controlling what German commanders believed about Allied intentions and capabilities, the deception operations achieved effects disproportionate to the physical resources employed. In the broader history of World War II, the radar deception operations represent a moment when technology, intelligence, and operational art came together perfectly. The right technical capabilities met the right strategic situation at the right time. The execution matched the ambition of the plan, and the results validated years of investment in capabilities that many had questioned. For the men who flew the aircraft, crewed the boats, and planned the operations, the success of the deception was satisfying but not surprising. They had trained for months to execute these missions. They understood their equipment and their procedures intimately. When the time came to perform, they simply did what they had practiced doing, with the professionalism and competence that characterized the Allied military forces at their best. The German officers who were deceived were not incompetent or foolish. They were experienced professionals who made reasonable assessments based on the information available to them. That information was carefully manipulated to lead them to false conclusions, but the conclusions themselves were logical, given what they believed they knew. The deception succeeded not because German commanders were stupid, but because Allied deception planners were skilled. In the decades since D-Day, the radar deception operations have been studied as examples of successful military deception. The technical details have been analyzed. The psychological principles have been examined. The organizational methods have been dissected. Yet the operations retain their power to impress through the elegant simplicity of the core concept. Use the enemy's own sensors to feed them false information that confirms their existing beliefs. The legacy of the secret Allied operations that fooled German radar before D-Day lives on in every modern electronic warfare system, in every military deception plan, and in every intelligence analysis that includes healthy skepticism about single-source reporting. The window strips that fluttered down over the English Channel on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, each reflecting radar energy that created false pictures on German screens, represent a revolution in warfare that continues to this day. The story reminds us that in warfare, as in other human endeavors, perception is often more important than reality. What commanders believe to be true affects their decisions more than what is actually true. Those who can control enemy perceptions can achieve victory through indirect means, without necessarily overwhelming enemy forces through direct combat. This principle, demonstrated so effectively on D-Day, remains as relevant now as it was 80 years ago.